Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar, Reimagining Boards for High Impact. I'm going to introduce these two other great folks on the screen with me here in just a second, but we are really excited to have you with us, and we're really excited to talk about this topic. We are in a moment in American history where now is the time for change. We are at a turning point in not just our civil society, but how nonprofits operate and how they can impact our communities and the ecosystems that they serve. We've done a ton of thinking here at BoardSource about this. You may be familiar with our purpose-driven board leadership work, which I'll talk about in just a second. But a lot of this was informed by the presenters that you're going to see here on the screen today and some of their work that they had done previous to BoardSource publishing our purpose-driven board leadership work in Stanford Social Innovation Review back in 2021. And what we think is really interesting is that there are boards out there doing incredible work. And part of our job here is to put vocabulary around that and to talk about the different designs for how boards can create just true change in their communities. And if it's not now, then when? Right? And I think we all made promises over the last 2 or 3 years that it's so easy to slip back into our history and habits, to go back to doing things the way they had always been done, when we had promised that we would never go back. And so this is a moment to listen and think and reflect on what can we do differently. And I think Jane and Marty, who are with us here, are big pieces of there. With that being said, I do want to introduce you really quickly to our presenters for today. And the two folks on the call today, we are just really excited to have, and it's Jane Wei-Skillern is first. She is a senior fellow at the Haas Business School at UC Berkeley. She was on the faculty of London Business School, Harvard Business School, and Stanford Graduate School of Business. She's taught social entrepreneurship, nonprofit strategy, and network leadership to MBAs and executives for over 2 decades. So obviously, she's got a wealth of experience and knowledge across a spectrum of areas, but particularly around network leadership, which we're going to talk about today. And then also we have Marty Kooistra, who is with us. He is the project manager currently behind the Black Home Initiative, a regional effort to address the systemic injustices in our housing system. Marty is a champion of coalition-based work at the intersection of community development, equity, and affordable housing. He has a ton of history besides that, but you can feel free to Google both of these people and read their extensive backgrounds and history. And I've just been extremely fortunate to be able to work with both of these individuals over the last few months, but also known both of them for several years. And when we talk about our purpose-driven board leadership work, I think it's really important to note we were inspired by and informed by a ton of the work that Jane had done around network leadership. And it led to our thinking about how boards could and should and need to change. And that really started with, pre-pandemic thinking about, are boards broken? Is the system that boards are operating with in our country, is it so dysfunctional that we have to have a moment for change? And I think that we've discovered that the answer to that question is yes. But one of the places that we first started seeing or really realizing or understanding that this was a moment for change is when we looked into our leading with intent data. And I'm just going to put up a few stats here on the screen that show what kind of alarmed us when we really did a deep dive into thinking about where boards were today and the things that we felt like we needed to address and how we could improve how boards operate. The first thing that we found when we really took a deep dive into that data was that boards are disconnected from the communities and the people that they serve. So almost half of our chief executives in our Leading with Intent survey said that they do not have the right board members to establish trust in the communities that they serve. And almost a third of boards said that they place only a third, place a high priority on knowledge of the community served. So think about that. Almost 2/3 of boards, or over 2/3 of boards, were not putting a priority on understanding the communities that they serve when they were recruiting board members. And you know what that means? That means that they create boards that are ill-informed about the ecosystems where they operate. So only 1/4 of boards told us that they prioritize knowledge of the organization's work or field in their board recruitment. And 11%, so think about this, 89% of boards are not prioritizing prior or current experience with a similar organization or mission area when they recruit board members. This is probably not going to come as a surprise to many of you, but boards are lacking in racial and ethnic diversity. So 78% of board members are white in the United States, and nearly 1 in 5 boards are all white. We've been doing this survey at BoardSource since 1993, and those numbers are relatively unchanged, even as demographics in this country, racial and ethnic demographics in this country have changed significantly. The number of people of color serving on boards has not really changed over the last 30 or so years. And then these last two probably also won't come as a surprise if you're familiar with boards. Boards are preoccupied with fundraising above all else. 70% of chief executive rated fundraising as very important, which was a higher rating than thinking strategically as a board or setting strategic direction. And then finally, what we found from looking at this data was that boards obviously were centered in 2 areas that were not related to strategy for the organization. They were centered in fundraising and oversight overwhelmingly. So if all of you are familiar with our purpose-driven board leadership work, and if you're not, we'll send a link with that with our follow-up email so you'll be able to read. But our purpose-driven board leadership work got us to center in 4 areas. Thinking about the purpose before the organization, so decentering or uncentering the organization as the board's primary reason for being, and instead recentering on purpose. Getting boards to center themselves in a respect for the ecosystem in which they operate and who they serve. Boards and board members who come to the board table with an equity mindset and weigh equity as a lens for the decisions that they are going to make, and understanding, are these decisions that we make perpetuating inequities that are in our society already, and what are we willing to do to avoid those inequities? And finally, ensuring that boards understand where their voice and power comes from and who authorizes them to make decisions on behalf of communities that they serve, and how we think about, when we sit around a board, how we have infused the voice of the people that we are making decisions on behalf of inside those board conversations. So once again, that purpose-driven board leadership work was a product of BoardSource's thinking, which was infused and influenced and inspired by a lot of the great work that Marty and Jane are going to talk about today, and particularly Jane Wei-Skillern's work around network leadership. So with that being said, I feel like I've talked plenty now, and I'm going to turn it over to Jane and Marty to take it from here.
Thank you so much, Andy, for that warm welcome. It's truly a pleasure to be here with all of you. I wanted to just take a step back and share some background and context for how Marty and I have come to this work and this partnership with BoardSource, and give you some understanding of where our understanding and passion for this topic of network leadership and aligned with BoardSource's purpose-driven board leadership. So what keeps us all together on this work is our goal to do work that really helps organization leaders such as yourselves achieve greater mission impact. That is first and foremost the purpose of this, and we hope we will accomplish that not just through the webinar today, but through a resource brief that is forthcoming, and you will be sent a copy of that as well. But just going back even a step further is to share a little bit about, next slide please, about this perennial challenge that we all face and we're all too familiar with, of a lofty ambition and the challenge of trying to get to that, click please, with all of these other challenges that are overwhelmingly taking our attention and make it nearly impossible to ever reach that mission. And that focus on getting to that mission is what really is core to what we're going to be talking about today. And there is a way to overcome a lot of these challenges without necessarily getting more money in the door or building all of these solutions to address that. Next slide, please. And that is a shift in thinking from going it alone, an inward focus, and pushing that boulder uphill and trying to get to an organizational approach to achieving your mission, and really shifting that mindset to, click please, a network as a vehicle for change. And Marty and I have been working as me as a researcher and Marty as a practitioner for decades in this work, looking at specifically how networks can phenomenally transform a mission and an organization's ability to achieve that mission. And that is why we are here today, to share some of that insight and specifically how that looks for board members and how you can apply that in your own work. Next slide, please. So just for some background, I have been looking at leading edge nonprofit networks for the last 20 years or so, looking at a range of different organizations in different fields, sometimes foundations, sometimes small grassroots organizations, and everything from economic development to social services, environmental conservation and climate change, arts and housing. And across all of these organizations, what I've seen time and time again, and certainly what Marty's seen is in his experience as an executive, is that successful networks have four principles, key principles in common. So this is very similar to what you see in the purpose-driven board leadership. Click, please. And these four principles are, next slide, please. Very simple and very much aligned with the purpose-driven board leadership. As Andy had mentioned, that BoardSource was inspired by this work that we had done early on to adapt this thinking to board work and how you could actually apply it to achieving greater mission as a governing board. And I'm going to go give you a little bit of background about what these look like in practice in the field for an operating nonprofit on the ground, so you get a better sense of how you as a governing board member might think about your role and how you could support this type of work. Next slide, please. So often organizations think about their work, nonprofit organizations think about their work as achieving their mission through increased fundraising, expanding, growing programs and services, building organizational infrastructure, and getting to the mission through that mechanism. And network leaders flip this approach on its head and say, well, wait a minute, let's focus on the mission first and foremost. How do we get to that? And there are many ways to achieve mission impact without necessarily growing your organization. And I've seen this in many instances where an organization, and I'll share case examples this morning from a case that I'm currently written that is not yet published, but it's a case of an international humanitarian aid organization. And they are working exactly this way. And our nice illustration for these principles. The first approach here is that instead of building infrastructure or trying to deploy more expats into an international context to try to do the humanitarian work, this organization specifically looked for existing partners from their previous experience that had a strong track record of success in implementation and impact on the ground, and began to explore how they could support them with technical assistance, trainings in order to do humanitarian relief work more effectively. And so they not only provided the technical support and training, but also provided additional funding and did did fundraising on behalf of their network partners, even without any of the funds flowing directly through their organization. So the idea that an organization would not only invest in the capacity of a peer organization, but also fundraise on their behalf without any direct benefit to them might seem altruistic at the outset, but if you think about it, this was a way to achieve mission impact, leverage mission impact, capitalizing on local knowledge and local relationships, and without the organization itself having to build all that infrastructure themselves. So that focus on mission, not organization, can open a whole range of opportunities that one might not have even thought about if you think about the mission being achieved not just through your organization, but through networks. Next slide, please. The second piece is that trust and shared values are far more important than formal control mechanisms such as contracts or MOUs or accountability systems. Now, this isn't to say that you can't have a formal contract in place or an MOU, but the glue that holds the network and the collaborative together is a deep trust with the partners involved. And this doesn't just happen by accident. This is something that's very deliberate, where funders, and their partners, or nonprofits and their partners, will work directly with their partners to find opportunities where the nonprofit partners can support each other in achieving the shared impact. So it's not a matter of just choosing partners who look good on paper and say, oh yes, we have complementarities, you're filling my gaps and I can help support yours, and therefore we should work together. In fact, there's a long and proactive due diligence process of finding partners who are committed to the mission equally, who have a track record for demonstrating that commitment, and who have integrity and, again, a long-term approach to how to solve this problem in a collaborative way. And after that due diligence is done, there's ongoing investment to foster the relationships in partnership with the community. And once that's done, and it's an ongoing process, you don't ever finish, but you start to build that relational foundation, then the partners are able to let go with trust. And what they find is that when you let people who are closer to the problem address the problems and formulate what they need and direct the resources in the way that they see most relevant with people who are directly in their communities, you get more effective results. You get more efficient results. In fact, you get more sustainable results because you're building local capacity into the communities themselves. So that trust, rather than trying to control from the top down, is absolutely essential. And the next piece, next slide, please, is related to this, and this emphasis on humility rather than brand building and self-promotion. So again, in the nonprofit space, we're all too familiar with this notion that we need to self-promote, we need to bring in the resources in order to do the work ourselves. And there's a huge missed opportunity if we don't think about our work not only as what else could we learn from the partners that we're working with, what else can we learn from the community that we're trying to serve, the beneficiaries we're working with, that all of those things are equally important to achieving mission impact. And so that degree of humility is absolutely imperative when it comes to program design and implementation, but also, of course, when it comes to getting recognition. And so this instance, this humanitarian organization, even when the network has achieved success and impact on the ground, they're sure to make sure the credit goes to their partners and they lift up the network's work rather than their own international NGO and their own brand. So it's the network that's being lifted up, and that in turn creates a reservoir of goodwill amongst the partners, where the partners see when we participate, we commit fully, we get credit for the works, we're not getting exploited by some other organization that's going to take credit and try to fundraise and build their own empire. We're actually in this together and we're benefiting collectively through this work. So that humility piece is absolutely essential. And finally, there's principle number 4, which is thinking about your work from a constellation perspective. So again, we're conditioned in the nonprofit philanthropic space to think about our work as we're the brightest star. We need to be the market leader. We need to show how competitive and impactful we are. And again, that goes along with the self-promotion and the focus on the organization. But the reality is every organization, no matter how well resourced, no matter how good their reputation, is just one drop in the bucket, and we are dwarfed by the missions that we seek to achieve. And therefore, thinking about the opportunity from a broad perspective of who else is out there that can add value to what we're doing, who else can we help that we can add value to what they're doing, and ally ourselves with each other so that we can build this beautiful constellation that lights up the sky. That's the way to get to transformational change. If we're content with just incremental change, organizations are probably sufficient to do that. But for transformational change, that requires networks. Next slide, please. So I wanted to just turn it over to you and ask if you're in your governing role position and thinking about these 4 principles, how you would think about what would be the most challenging of the 4. So would it be the mission, not organization, trust, not control, humility rather than brand building and self-promotion, or thinking as far as constellations rather than stars?
And while folks answer that poll question, and I see that those results are coming in, I just want to let you know, Jane and Marty, we've already got a couple of questions, and remind folks that that Q&A button down there is open and available for any questions you have. We're going to hold on to a couple of these questions, well, to most of them until the end, but these are great questions so far. I did say earlier that the chat function was where you could put any other kind of thoughts or comments. That is disabled, actually. So feel free to put it in the Q&A and in the chat, in the Q&A function, any comments or thoughts or questions you have, and we'll see them there, and we'll manage them on this end. So with that being said, it looks like we've got some poll results coming in.
Okay, well, thank you. And so I'm just going to speak to the one that seemed to be the most challenging, and then Marty will speak to a lot of these as a whole, and then we'll have a chance to have some more Q&A to discuss some of the questions that you all have. So thank you for participating in the poll. And I see that trust rather than control is something that's very challenging for people to begin implementing. And what I have seen is that, interestingly, again, this isn't a process that happens automatically. You have to put the effort into finding trusted partners. So again, oftentimes I see organizations that do a very extensive due diligence process of getting to know their partners, getting to see their track record, talking to beneficiaries of their partners, talking to other organizations that have worked with these partners or potential partners to see what is their track record, how committed are they to the mission, how much integrity have they demonstrated through their actions. Once you find those people, and it's as management guru Jim Collins talks about, getting the right people on the bus. Once you get those people into a community and you start fostering and nurturing that community that you're a part of, that's where you can then let go with trust and see amazing things happen. And again, I wouldn't be telling you this if I haven't seen it myself. I've built a whole career studying these types of examples. And I can tell you, when people find the right partners who are values aligned, who are equally committed to the mission, and they begin working with the trust-based relationship and continually invest deliberately into this relational foundation, because there's always turnover, there's change in leadership, there's new staff that comes in. You have to continue to invest and think of that as important as any other task that you do. The relationship and the community that you build to solve these problems is the key to actually getting to the mission impact that we're all striving for. So that piece, I can tell you time and time again, working through that governance tool. And I would say that trust is perhaps the most powerful governance tool we have in the world. That yes, contracts and MOUs can help provide a structure, they can be a basis for conversation. But at the end of the day, if you think about our most important relationships in our lives, those with our families, our loved ones, our children, our partners, it's trust rather than control that makes the relationship function. It's a give and take, it's an openness, it's a degree of communication and authenticity that allows you to be vulnerable and ask for help. And in turn, your partners can feel the same, and you work as a collaborative, as a collective that's seeking to move forward together. And so we'll speak to that a little bit more later on. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to Marty and have him share what we've learned. But before that, let me just close out this poll and then just remind you that this work is very much aligned with the purpose-driven board leadership that many of you are already familiar with. Click, please. And you'll see that each of the principles maps on directly to the purpose-driven board leadership piece. And what I've just done is given you a snapshot of what does network leadership come from, what does it look like in the field, and then of course you're familiar with purpose-driven board leadership, and you see that they mesh very tightly together. And at the same time, what we sought to do with this next piece that Marty's going to talk about is to go deeper into what does this look like for board members? How does this translate into your own work, and how can you put these principles to use to achieve your mission impact? Marty, over to you.
Well, thank you, Jane, and greetings, everyone. So glad to have such a large crew with us, and the questions that are coming in the Q&A are remarkable. We're going to try our best to get through these next slides really quickly and get to the Q&A if we can. And we'll also work with BoardSource for those questions that we couldn't directly answer and make sure we try to get you all the information you desire. So it's been a privilege working with Jane and the BoardSource folks over the last several months, interviewing over a dozen leaders from various sizes and dimensions of nonprofit organizations. And we set out to do these interviews in a way to try to figure out, was there alignment? How was there alignment between the network leadership work that Jane's been doing for years and the purpose-driven work that Ann started with BoardSource? And what we came up with is 6 recommendations, and I want to walk through those with you now. These might not surprise many of you because we know that you are all, as Jane mentioned earlier, working on the front lines, doing your best to try to bring about the change we all believe is necessary. But these 6 things sort of stood out as we tried to synthesize the information. Next slide, please. The first, and one that shouldn't seem all that counterintuitive, is this notion of allocating board time to mission critical activities. Let me just put a little finer point on it, because you've all studied how to have effective board meetings, how to construct your agendas towards the critical, all of that. But what we're asking now, in light of all of what Andy queued us up to, what we saw in the Leading with Intent study, is making sure that when we have limited board time, that we're using it as wisely as we can. So the first question we want to ask ourselves is, how much time does our board actually have to do our work? And when you think about it, many boards don't have more than 24 hours a year when they are actually in place doing their work. So if you sit back at the beginning of the year and you ask the next question of, does the use of our 24 hours in this upcoming year actually prioritize our values? Does it actually speak to the things that we want it to? And this can help actually construct a different way in which you use your board time, making sure you're as effective as possible at addressing those most critical issues, whether they be about equity, engagement in the ecosystem, or trying to build networks across a broader spectrum. Next slide, please. The second one is making sure that our recruitment strategies build community voice into the board. We obviously saw the statistics with Leading Intent. There have been years and years of help from BoardSource and other consultants trying to work on diversifying our boards, making sure they're representative of community and so on. And if we go to the next slide, a lot of us use a traditional matrix. We were trained to do this for decades that actually gets us to skills that we're looking for. The challenge is that when we recruit board members specifically for technical expertise, we might end up focusing too narrowly on a definition of governance. So this is one example of a different typology I have used over the years in discerning where are the gaps on our board. Is it usually in that area of resource controllers? That's for boards that are looking to dominate in the fundraising space. But when we talk about what we're discussing today, the bigger question is on the issue knower side. Lived experience. Do we have people on our board that actually are connected to the issue we're trying to solve? And so when you read through the purpose-driven document that BoardSource put together, you'll see a deep reflection on this. Next slide, please. Third is ground decision-making and community wisdom. Is our strategic direction based on the shared priorities derived from and informed by authentic community engagement? And when we talk about that authentic community engagement, to Jane's earlier point, when we're working on the trust, not control, and humility, not brand, where are we on that community engagement spectrum? Are we way over on the left, just informing community? Or are we fully on the right, where we're empowering and creating ownership by community in what our nonprofit organization is doing? And what is the board's role in ensuring that this takes place? We're actually giving support and sanction to staff and management to lead in this way. Next slide, please. The fourth is deepening board and staff connections. How much time and energy do we dedicate to building an internal learning network with trust and respectful relationships? And what's the through line of understanding from the frontline staff all the way through to those in the governance role? Now, let's be really clear, and we talk about this in the paper that you'll see. We have worked for years, decades, many of us, on emphasizing that demarcation between board and staff responsibilities, between governance and implementation. And it's really important that we do not, do damage to those situations, because we all know what happens when we end up with board members who are too involved in implementation and end up bringing that micromanagement to the board table, etc. But what we are finding and what we see is that many times our emphasis on where we find board members and who we put in place may not have us connected, and the frontline staff can be the most valuable in helping make sure that works. It's also true that it's difficult to see how our relationships more broadly with those we're serving and with community can be healthy if we don't have healthy internal relationships. Next slide, please. Bringing network aspirations to the ecosystem. This is really all about what Jane has been talking about. What is our board's commitment to engaging as an authentic network partner? And there's tons of challenges with this, and we will talk more about those. But if we go to the next slide, one of the organizations I worked with for many years had a deep emphasis, and we trained our local affiliates to build connections and relationships in community. Don't worry about trying to read the details in this, other than to say, in this particular model, you end up with the organization and its brand as the common interest. Next slide, please. Whereas what we're really saying is we want to have that brand serving as a node, the value of that organization contributing, as Jane said, to part of a constellation rather than a shining star, and putting the issue, the thing we're trying to work on, as the common interest. So while the first slide was really about service delivery, this is about being a catalyst. This is about being a true network partner and building up and fulfilling other organizations in the ecosystem. Next slide, please. The last one is reframing accountability and success. So does the evaluation of our performance of our organization include more than internal metrics and indicate an emphasis on equity, sector, and society impact? And this is really one of the last challenges that we tended to hear most of in the interviews, is this whole notion of how do you account for the work that's accomplished in a network mindset, in a network way, and how do we make sure that when we look at what we've accomplished, that it's all about measuring our success against our vision statements, which tend to be highly aspirational. So those are the 6 primary things that we discovered as we were doing these interviews. And now we have a poll question. Which of these 6 recommendations do you think was going to be the most challenging for you to implement? Or for those of you who've been working at this, tell us which one tends to be the most challenging for you. And we appreciate all of you participating in this poll. It's like we're getting some across the board responses, but this latter one seems to be resonating most with folks at this point.
And I would just hop in here, Marty, and just remind folks, we've got a ton of questions in that Q&A spot. We're not going to be able to get to all of them. So if you're on the line and you've got a question, go scroll through those questions that are in the Q&A and click on the ones that you find most interesting, or that there's the most energy around. We'll make sure we get to those that kind of have the highest upvotes. And like Marty said, we'll also try to address those after the presentation as well in some way or form. Back to you, Marty.
Super. Thank you, Andy. Well, let's end that poll there, Mina, and we're definitely seeing some resonance with the accountability and success metrics component, but otherwise spread fairly interestingly across the rest. So thank you all for participating, and look forward to seeing that brief where we get into these in more detail. But let's spend the rest of our time, if we can, Andy, on trying to get to some of these questions.
Absolutely. So I am coming through here, and I'm going to share just these poll results so you can see, so the folks on the line can see kind of where we landed. And like Marty mentioned, reframe accountability and success, I think, has our plurality here at 34%. One that was getting a lot of energy earlier when we first opened the Q&A, Marty and Jane, is from Tom, who wanted to ask the question, and I know, Jane, you hit on it briefly about a board matrix. And he noted that many of us have a board matrix that we use to help board director recruitment, and these have the typical traits on them. But what would you add to ensure that organizations can recruit individuals that that have a network mindset?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think one of the things that I've seen time and time again of the types of people who excel at this are people who are extraordinarily ambitious and visionary, but at the same time, very humble. And at the same time, they're very good at relationships. They're people. They can communicate effectively with anybody from a Fortune 500 CEO to the people in the field that they're trying to serve, their beneficiaries, the community partners that they work with. So those skill sets don't necessarily always show up on a resume, but I think doing the due diligence of finding out background checks, finding out their reputation in the field is really powerful. How have they been with other organizations and other partners, What's their reputation for being somebody that plays well with others in the sandbox? And even asking them in the interview process, what have they done that demonstrates that? What are they most, or even asking open-ended, what are you most proud of in your work? And if it's something that's very individualistic, kind of organization centric versus, oh, I'm most proud of this collaborative that I helped to facilitate and build or whatnot, that type of behavior it does show through in people's track record over time, for sure.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add, if you noticed on the slide with the 4 boxes that we showed earlier, the question of whether someone demonstrates that they're an integrator or whether they're an issue knower, having folks who have been in the space and have done that kind of work of integration, bringing people together, all of those qualities that Jane mentioned are pretty critical. And I think that that's probably the point in the recruitment process. When we use the typical matrix and we look at our existing board, who's going off, who do we need to replace, we generally look at the skill sets, but don't look beyond that to whether or not the person brings some of these other qualities that Jane is mentioning.
Thank you both. Another question we got pretty early here is, and something that I hear a lot is that relationship between the board and the CEO or chief executive. What if the trust between the board and the chief executive has already been seriously damaged? How do you approach these opportunities with this kind of hanging over the organization's head?
Yeah, unfortunately, not an uncommon problem. Sometimes organizations and their executives grow in different directions where there may have been some misconnections in the hiring process or in the communication. We all know that relationship, especially between the chief executive and the board chair, board president, is critical. And if you don't invest in at least that relationship and being able to build the trust out from there, it can be very hard to repair. Having been involved in a number of these kind of situations over the years, generally speaking, the two parties need to get together in an honest and safe way. Sometimes that requires a third party to support that safety in the room, but there just needs to be the candid conversation about, are we both committed, board and executive, to trying to make this work, or would it be better off for us to part ways? And I think in my experience, most groups wait far too long to come to that conclusion. If there is a commitment there, then certainly working on rebuilding that trust takes time. There's got to be indicators of that people feel confident with. But you also have to be honest about the point of saying, this may not be right for either of us, and let's address it in the most humane, appropriate, and respectful way.
At the same time, I would add that there's oftentimes the sense that there's a negative dynamic between people, but once they get to know each other, share backgrounds more openly, share their own personal stories, what they're most committed to, what they're most excited about, oftentimes those more relaxed, open conversations that aren't necessarily in a formal meeting can help to find common ground where there wasn't any before. And I've certainly seen that in facilitating workshops and helping people understand how to implement these network principles, that oftentimes people come in with folded arms and they're reluctant to participate, but you give them a chance to interact informally, whether it's over a meal, and have regular meetings like that, that really does foster the human to human connection that can help build bridges between people where previously there was a misunderstanding.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's something that we promote heavily here, is making sure we're building in social time for boards to get to know each other. Cheryl had a question, which actually several folks seemed to chime in, and there was a lot of energy around this. How do you get funders on board with the network approach, since most funding is based on an organizational model? And then Todd chimed in as well, and he said, I too would like to hear an example of a funder who got behind the building of a network model in pursuit of a mission. The principles are easy to agree with, but time consuming, and the need to sustain organization is a pressing, almost daily challenge for chief executives.
Yes, without a doubt. And certainly I've looked at a few foundations that have done the work in this way, and they did it not because they loved my research or they loved the name of the framework, but they did it by necessity because they saw that the mission was so ambitious, they had to work in this way. So one example that I've written quite a bit about is the Energy Foundation. And there's an article that I believe we will have in the resources. It's a foundation review article on the 4 principles for successful funding collaboratives. And the idea is, again, that the foundation saw this at the time that Energy Foundation was founded decades ago, was they were the first foundation focused on energy issues in the US. And they saw that they didn't have all of the answers and needed other people in their network in order to begin to understand this. So even the founding strategy was determined by interviewing over 100 different experts in the field of energy to begin to shape what the strategy would look like. So they didn't get a funder board to only worry about how do we resource this entity. And they were very fortunate. They had some large funders that put money in initially to support the organization for the first few years. But what they did was really drive the strategy based on what they were learning from the field, and then brought in relevant partners, and then helped to build the field as a whole by investing in other countries, other regions, developing their own energy foundation counterparts. So they helped to seed Energy Foundation in China and in Europe and in South America and in India to create a global network, because they knew we can't solve or address this climate energy issue on our own. We need others out there. We need to lift up the field. So oftentimes people, leaders, executives, board members come to this work by necessity. They see this as the most obvious path if you're trying to maximize mission impact. Of course, the case to be made to funders, there are many examples out there that have been documented of organizations working in this way that have achieved more efficient, more effective, and more sustainable results. I've written a lot about it. There's other people who are out there who've written about it. So there are resources to help make the case to your board. And then, of course, even looking within your own communities where you've had success. If you think about where have you had the biggest success, the biggest impacts, I would bet that more often than not, they were successful collaboratives because they had many of these principles of trust, humility, that constellation viewpoint, and again, people investing because of the larger mission at the center rather than their organizations. So look for those examples in your community and share them with your funders, share them with others in your community, your potential partners, to bring people on. And what I found also is success breeds success. Once you get a little bit of a taste of this way of working, you won't ever go back because you see the power of it. You see how it's transformational. And frankly, it's a more rewarding way of working alongside and with communities in relationship with others, rather than this competitive dog eat dog. It's all about me and my organization. It's just a completely different way of working. But I'm certainly a big believer only because I've seen the evidence, and it's pretty irrefutable.
Yeah, thank you, Jane. Let me just add a couple of things from current experience of a network I'm building right now with a number of folks on trying to increase Black home ownership. So leaning in, as Jane was saying, to where funders might be today or want to be is all about systems level change. And bringing that to the foray is critical. And one of the things that we're trying to do in this current network is work on the enabling environment such that the entire funding and philanthropic ecosystem is aligned. And it takes a tremendous amount of time and energy using relationships with the community foundations and others to bring philanthropy together and having these hard conversations with them. And we're wanting to be very careful not to dissuade anyone from funding the current organizations that members that make up the network at the level necessary for them to continue to do their work. But how, if we all agree to that shared priority of true systems change, can we get incremental resources? And how can we make sure that when we're allocating those resources, they actually emphasize the notion of a network as Jane has portrayed it? And so we've been somewhat successful in getting a few of the foundations making their contributions actually right into the contracts of the funding, that this is about building and supporting and facilitating a network as opposed to it being specifically about your organization. But it takes a tremendous amount of education and time, as has been indicated in the question, to do that hard work.
Awesome, thanks. We still have a ton of questions, but I'm going to try to center on some of these that have a lot of energy around them. And I know we have a couple on more questions about funders, particularly getting funders on board with this principle. But I'm going to start with this. And one of the great things about this is I love seeing all these old friends here in the chat asking these questions, and just folks I know are dedicated to the sector. But old friend of mine, Marty Martin, asked, when implementing these principles, how do you overcome the competitive business mindset which so many board members bring from their work to service on a nonprofit board, as well as the fundraising recognitions which nonprofits promote?
Well, yes. And hi, Marty. It's great to have you join us. Marty's an old friend from decades ago from my time at Harvard. So it's great to be here with you. Thanks for that question. I think one of the key things, and again, I get that mindset because I've spent my entire career in business schools, and this research really was emerging as a response to that mindset, because I saw that it was all too common. It was actually limiting our ability as social impact organizations to get to the impact that we were seeking. And I think what we need to do is train leaders from the private sector to understand that the nature of social impact work is fundamentally different. It's just not the same as manufacturing widgets or building a company to generate shareholder value. In fact, if you are a social impact organization and everybody steals your proprietary knowledge and runs with it and starts to change the world without your involvement, you've won. Whereas if you're a private sector organization and someone does that, that's your competition eating your lunch. That's a problem. But for social impact, you want that exponential impact because people are emulating the work that you do because they see the impact of it. You want to see large scale collaboration on the work, because we all know that these social issues are so large and so complex, they dwarf even most business challenges that private sector organizations face. So getting leaders to understand that fundamental shift from social impact organizations have different requirements and different goals, that is a key piece of just basic knowledge sharing. And then again, many cases show and demonstrate the power of this way of working when you work in this way, rather than that top-down constrained way where you really just get incremental results at best. Oftentimes you just get outright failure. I mean, how many times can we point to a collaborative that really wasn't very collaborative, that didn't demonstrate any of these principles, and it went nowhere? It was just a series of committee meetings that didn't get anywhere. Whereas I've seen, again, example after example of cases where organizations worked in this way. They got the right people on the bus. They built a culture around this network culture and these network principles, and they got results that were beyond what you could have even imagined. They've got local voice and participation in communities. They have capacity built in the field, in the local communities, because the partners themselves on the ground are doing the work and building that capacity into their own local staff. And you get a sustainability component because it doesn't rely on an ongoing subsidy from outside. It's built into the community, and then the communities themselves are able to lift themselves up and begin to solve and address their own challenges. So again, it's sharing those successful stories and helping these other leaders who come from the private sector understand the difference between social impact work and the private sector.
Yeah. And let's be clear about a couple of things too. One is, in that recruitment process, when you're doing your interviews with potential board members, you can begin to suss out whether or not you get a sense that someone can pivot from what they bring from their day-to-day work into that boardroom environment. The second thing, and this may sound harsh, but is real, is that the vast majority of board members that we bring onto our organizations tend to be donors to the organization themselves. So there's an inherent loyalty that comes with that relationship. And when we think about the duties of care, loyalty, and obedience, we typically talk about that duty of loyalty in the legal realm. But what we're wanting to say is, let's make sure that we find board members who are loyal to our purpose and our mission, as Jane calls it, not necessarily loyal to the organization. And so there's some disconnects that happen in all of this, because we tend to also want to try to find people who are in that resource controller box that we mentioned earlier, who are going to come to the table and help us generate the resources that we need for our organization. And so there is a real challenge, I think, in pointing all of these things out and making sure that in that recruitment process, you're trying to find out, is there a mindset around the ecosystem? Is there a mindset around networks versus purely walking into the room? And just be very clear about this. Your board members are typically at work, and then they show up for a meeting. How do they even find that moment to check themselves at the door and say, okay, this is something different that I'm about to enter now than what I've been doing for the last number of hours? And all of these things are important ingredients to trying to overcome this challenge.
Thank you both. I know we kind of hit on this a few minutes ago, but I want to dive in a little bit more here, just because we have so much energy around these questions. But it's about educating funders to these principles. And Stephanie and Cheryl both asked this. And but how do we educate funders to the principles? Nonprofits promote themselves to position themselves for funding. It's challenging to think about being passed over for funding. So just wondering if you had thoughts there.
Yeah, I think one thing that I've seen a lot of network leaders do who are catalyzing this approach in their fields is sometimes they don't have they don't have funder support at the outset, that they just started to fly under the radar doing the work in this way because they saw the opportunity and the potential for impact. And as they start to engage in this way, the partnership, the network starts to bear fruit, and they start getting some traction. They get more partners who want to join. They get community level engagement at a level that they hadn't seen before. They get more impact on the ground. And that's where it attracts more funding. And we've seen many examples of the pie growing for organizations that are leading in this way, because once you've established that set of norms and that way of behaving, the successes speak for themselves, and funders always want to be associated with the success. So it may take some initial experimentation and pilots to get to that level of engagement, but once it gets going, it's truly powerful. I'll give one quick example. It was a land trust in Alabama. It's called the Freshwater Land Trust, and they started as a fledgling organization trying to preserve river habitat and the species that live there. And they started with small organization. And instead of thinking about their work from a conservation mission only, they began to think, who else is out there that we could engage? And they brought the Chamber of Commerce in, because they said, if we build this multi-use trail, preserve this habitat, we can bring more tourists, there are more recreational activities, we can promote the businesses and have more tourism in this whole region. So they brought the Chamber of Commerce. They actually brought the public health government agencies into the conversation as well, because the multi-use trail could create more opportunities for physical and mental health benefits for the community members. And so they created this organization that has grown into now a $40 million trust in Alabama. And my colleague, Wendy Jackson, who spearheaded that effort, talks about, if we could do this in Alabama, where we had all these barriers, but what we did was build a network, and we did it by bringing in everybody you could possibly think of and looked at the issue from their perspective and brought them in, and they got these results, and now they're nationally recognized. And Wendy was recruited to the National Land Trust Alliance based on her work here. So again, once you get that flywheel going, the results begin to bring in other players, including funders.
Yeah, and let's just quickly build on that to say, when we help start new networks and work in this way, we generally follow 5 C's, and you can find these at SSIR, and we'll make them available to you as well. But you start by clarifying the purpose. If you can get the ecosystem in a room and build a shared priority that everyone embraces, then you begin to convene all the right people and make sure that the funders are actually involved in those conversations. And you cultivate the trust that Jane talked about amongst all the parties through a number of exercises and getting to learn about each other more deeply. Soon, folks will begin to share in a learning network mindset what they're actually doing already. And at that point, when you come back to saying, this is what we're already doing, these are the assets that we have, this is our shared priority, then we start talking about co-creation. And when we get into that co-creation mode to really hit that shared priority, that's when we tap into the funding community and say, what are the gives and gets that you can bring to the table to make this happen? It's all a very detailed and roadmap process. It takes a tremendous amount of time and energy, but it isn't going to happen naturally. It's one of those things that the gravitational pulls are working in the opposite direction. And so there has to be a strong commitment, as Jane said earlier, to investing the time.
All right, we have like 1 minute left. So I'm going to try to get one more question in here. We're going to knock one more out before we finish up. But I do want to remind everybody that these slides are coming. We're going to send, the link is coming. We're going to try to address some of these other questions, but you will definitely get a link to this presentation here shortly. So I wanted to also ask this question, because this was interesting to me. Don't the big guys in the network automatically have the louder voice? How do you build equity?
Yes, well, that's one of the things that I mentioned earlier, is humility is key. And the people who catalyze these networks and build them well are as humble as any other partner in the network. They realize that their assets, whatever they're bringing to the table, even if it's the most financial resources, that's not the end all be all, that all their network partners arrayed around them bring equally valuable assets, and therefore they interact with their partners as peers and as equals, not as somebody that has the upper hand. That's just the bottom line. Humility absolutely is essential.
And if you are in the position of being one of those organizations that is considered the big dog in the room, you definitely have to start from this frame of reference of being completely demonstrating that humility. So you don't draw people to your meeting space, all of the things that would indicate that you are in control.
Okay, perfect. Ended right on time. Jane and Marty, I can't thank you both enough. We really, really appreciate you sharing with us today, and we appreciate your insights and being able to share this with our network. And as you can see on the screen, we're going to make that recording available on BoardSource's YouTube page. We'll also send a link in the follow-up email, as well as a post-webinar survey. We appreciate you. If you have any questions, thoughts, concerns, would like more information, feel free to email us at training@boardsource.org, and we will get back in touch. With that being said, One more big, huge thank you to Jane and Marty. And I also want to make sure that we thank Mina Shen here at BoardSource, who is our Director of Membership and Marketing, who has had a huge hand in making sure that this webinar went well today. So thank you all again. And again, let us know if you had questions at training@boardsource.org. We'll see you soon, folks. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.